In this video, I want to talk about current issues for reform for defences in Australian copyright law. Particularly, the Australian Law Reform Commission has just released a report that recommends that Australia introduce a US-style fair use provision into our law. You'll recall that Australia currently has a limited set of purpose-specific defences or exceptions to copyright infringement. The ALRC instead recommends that we replace these purpose-specific exceptions to copyright infringement with a general open-ended fair use test. So the fair use test in the US is based on an assessment of four separate factors. The first is the purpose and character of the use, including whether the use is commercial or non-profit, the nature of the copyrighted work. The third is the amount and substantiality of the portion used. And the fourth is the effect of the use upon the potential market. It turns out that purpose and character and effect of the use end up being the most important factors in US fair use analysis. But the point of the test and the difference with Australian law is that fair use enables courts to look at the totality of the circumstances in order to determine whether a particular use should be permissible without a license or not. So it enables users of copyright material to make an argument that their use should be privileged because it's socially beneficial, or because it is required by freedom of speech, or some other reason for which it should be considered to be a fair use. So the main arguments given by the Australian Law Reform Commission in recommending fair use revolve around the flexibility and simplicity of the test compared to Australian exceptions. In particular, the ALRC argues that fair use is advantageous because it's technology neutral. It promotes the public interest in transformative uses. So these are artistic and non-consumptive uses that I'll talk about in a bit. And fair use acts to operate to provide the breathing room for innovation. That is, investment in new ways of using and disseminating content. Finally, the ALRC suggests that fair use better aligns with normal consumer expectations. And you'll see this, if you practice in the area, that oftentimes Australian citizens believe that we have a fair use exception. It turns out, of course, that we don't, but the power of the fair use, both intuitively, in that it is fair to allow certain types of private or transformative uses, for example, and the prevalence of US copyright rhetoric means that a lot of Australian copyright users think that we already have fair use. So on the first point, simplicity. Australia uses a really extensive and quite complex set of specific royalty-free exceptions for copyright infringement. A lot of these come under exceptions for private copying and format shifting, for example. So there's specific exceptions for books, newspapers, and periodicals, specific exceptions for photographs and videotapes and format shifting music, transferring it from one format to another. Specific exceptions for personal private uses, performances in classroom, and so on and so on. There are exceptions for photographing buildings and sculptures in public space, exceptions for incidentally including artistic works in a film or a broadcast. There's exceptions for public recitation or extracts of works, or creating new works based on works by the same author. This system creates quite a complex copyright act, as you might imagine. It's a drafting process that attempts to foresee the types of works, the types of uses of works that will be socially beneficial, and create specific exceptions around those particular purposes. The US approach, the fair use approach, instead simplifies these tests and leaves it to the courts to come up with a jurisprudence for when uses will be considered to be fair. So all of those uses that I've just mentioned are likely to be excused as fair uses under the US Copyright Act, leading to a much more simple approach. Some claim or are concerned that it is also a more unpredictable approach, although the empirical work doesn't seem to support that claim. The other reason, or the next reason, the ALRC suggests adopting transformative use is to maintain technological neutrality of the Copyright Act. So, for example, the Copyright Act now includes provisions that enable time shifting and format shifting of particular works, but they're worded in language that is quite restrictive about the technologies that are used. So because our law is always drafted in retrospect, it takes quite a long time for it to adapt to these new uses. So we only got the format and time shifting exceptions that allow people to use VCRs in their home about 25 years after the introduction of the commercial video cassette recorder. Essentially, we introduced these exceptions at about the point at which the technology itself becomes obsolete and we move to digital. This, for a lot of people and for the ALRC, is a real problem with our method of drafting exceptions. It's not able to maintain the same function as technology changes. Fair use enables courts to adapt the law in response to technological change rather than waiting on legislatures to introduce new restrictions on the rights of copyright owners to deal with particular new developments. Another set of reasons why the ALRC suggests we might introduce fair use revolve around transformative use, the use of copyright material for different purposes. So this is not ripping off material to pass off as your own and to undercut the copyright owner's monopoly, but taking of copyright material either for artistic work purposes or for non-consumptive purposes. I'll use an example of both. So under Australian law, it's permissible to reuse copyright material if you're using it for the purposes of criticism or review, or parody or satire, or news reporting, for example. What is not permissible is to reuse copyright material for merely artistic purposes, or for communicative purposes, merely to communicate it in a different way. So there are plenty of examples that you might think of in which US creators have the ability to repurpose, sample, mix, mash up existing works in order to create new works, new expression. These sorts of things are not permissible under Australian law. Quick examples. Pogo, for example, who uses clips from Disney films to make innovative new songs. These sampling artists would need a license for each clip that they use if it's a substantial part of the original in order to be able to create their works. Other examples you can see here, the Shepard Fairey Hope poster used in the Obama campaign, building off a press photograph by Garcia. More controversially, we have the works of Patrick Carrier. This particular work was recently held to be a fair use in the US, but would unlikely to be excusable in Australia. The other types of transformative works that we might seek to protect that are permissible in the US under the fair use, but not under Australian fair dealing, are non-consumptive uses of copyright material. So this means when digital material is processed by a machine, necessarily copies are made as part of that process. So in the digital world, for example, we might often want to run algorithms of various kinds over copyright material. Search engines, for example. Google's search engine operates by creating a copy of websites, of all of the websites that it can crawl in order to index and reproduce it in response to search results. In Australia, there's no specific exception for search engines. In the US, these search engines are able to operate because they're able to argue that their works, their uses of copyright works, are transformative, that they are fair. On the balance of those four factors, Google's activities are fair because it increases discoverability of the works and it doesn't interfere with the legitimate market of the copyright owner. So these are the sorts of things that are not permissible to develop in Australia. Another example, sticking with Google, is the Google Books arrangement, where Google scanned hard copy books in order to create a searchable index of physical books that was not previously available. It's important, innovative work that has lots of downstream benefits, not the least of which, for example, to provide better access to the written word to people who are blind or otherwise visually impaired. But it also increases discoverability, it increases the opportunity to engage in research. We now have a corpus of books that has been digitized that we can do a whole range of research activities to study how the languages have evolved, how different concepts have come in and out of popular consciousness, and so on and so on. These are the sorts of things that are made possible by innovations in technology that rely on copying and analyzing and reproducing and communicating the results of those analyses of existing copyright material. And these are the things that are not permissible in Australia unless we introduce fair use. So the debate around fair use really centers around these core issues. Issues of flexibility, simplicity, future-proofing Australian law. But opponents of fair use worry that now's not the time to weaken copyright. They worry that copyright owners need to have as strong rights as possible to control the uses of their works, and that any weakening of the right might undercut their incentives and the revenues that they can receive from selling access in particular works. And there's a different view of how we think innovation and creativity happens that underpins a lot of these debates. On the one hand, the copyright owners argue that they will have incentives to create these new types of accessing and distributing works if we strengthen the copyright monopoly sufficiently. On the other hand, people who argue that, in favor of what we call disruptive innovation suggest that innovation typically happens by people who are not directly involved in the existing business models. And that the reason that we've seen entrants like Google, for example, or Apple's iTunes, innovate and provide breakthrough ways for accessing copyright material is because they have come from outside of the existing business model structures. And that their arguments, and the arguments of people who support that type of innovation, is that fair use provides a safety valve. It provides a way to encourage new types of innovation that we hadn't previously thought of in order to create new markets that there wouldn't be a commercial incentive for an existing operator to invest in. Other arguments around fair use focus on its impact on people, on individuals, either on the ability of people to speak and to express themselves, so there's a big free speech element to fair use, or the ability of people to access knowledge. This is the user's rights aspect that says the consumers of information need to be able to exercise their right to access information, that its fair use provides a fundamental part of the copyright balance by drawing the limitations around what copyright owners can control. This is particularly important in the digital age, because in the digital age, nearly every interaction with copyright material becomes a potential infringement. In the analog world, it was never an infringement to read a book or to share a book with a friend. These were, in the analog world, important limits to the monopolies of copyright owners. In the digital world, these acts become infringements. They are reproductions and communications of copyright works. This means that the structure of the balance between rights holders and consumers has once again been shifted. The argument that consumer groups make is that fair use is required to restore some of that balance. The argument that copyright owners make is that the copyright balance has also been shifted in the other direction by making infringement much more easy, and that therefore copyright should not be weakened any further. In fact, it should be strengthened in the digital age in order to enable returns on investment for publishers and distributors. Finally, people worry about artistic uses. Because all expression fundamentally builds on existing expression, people who are worried not just about appropriation art, but more broadly about the way in which we can use existing material as an influence in the creation of new works. So you might think, for example, of Men at Work's case against the owners of the Kookaburra Sets in the Old Gum Tree. And in that case, the use of an iconic flute riff that was made in 1932, I believe, is 80 years old, and really a part of Australian culture. The use of that riff in creating a new icon of Australian culture was fundamental to the creative process. These are the types of uses that might be excusable under a fair use regime, but are not permissible without a license under a more limited fair dealing regime, because they don't, or the uses are not made for the purposes of parody, satire, or criticism, review, or news reporting, or any of the other limited purposive exceptions. So people who worry about creativity worry about the costs of licensing inputs to creative expression and the transaction costs involved in finding copyright owners and negotiating licenses, argue for expanded fair use in order to provide more breathing room to creators. This is an ongoing debate, and it's likely to heat up over the next few years as Australia struggles to determine how it will adapt copyright in the digital age.